From the Free Press, this is Honestly, and I'm Barry Weiss. It's the biggest peacetime crime and cover-up in British history.
Well, the UK's rape grooming scandal, let's call it a rape scandal, not really about even grooming, it's just about people raping young, often underage girls, is a grotesque stain on Britain's standing as a world leader in morality and the rule of law.
Thousands of young girls, mostly children, were groomed and raped by immigrant gangs across the UK over a period of decades.
One evening in 2006, a 12-year-old girl went into this police station. She reported that she had been molested in a local graveyard. The police officers here told her to sober up and come back later.
Police turned the girls away.
As she left, she was accosted by two further men who took her away in a car and raped her. They gave her money for a bus fare and dropped her in the streets in this town in Greater Manchester. She was picked up by another man.
Detectives were discouraged from investigating the crimes.
Many senior police officers were fearful of intervening because they may be branded racist.
Politicians and prosecutors did their best to sweep it under the rug.
There was cowardice from the police, there was cowardice from social services, there was potential cowardice from others.
Journalists, at least many of them, skipped the biggest story of their lives.
The scale of the raping of children by these gangs is so wide and has gone on for so long and was allowed to happen because of various agencies not doing their job properly. It is such a serious matter. So many lives have been destroyed. We must do everything possible to ensure it never happens again.
A culture of silence came to envelop the United Kingdom. Why? Why did that happen? And who's to blame? And why are we talking about it right now?
The PM's plans overshadowed by vicious attacks from the world's richest man, Elon Musk using his social media platform X to launch an onslaught against the PM, accusing him of being complicit in the rape of Britain for failing to tackle grooming gangs, while personally attacking one of Starmer's ministers.
And the fact that Elon Musk has forced this back to public attention and is essentially looks like he's going to hold the government and indeed the entire bureaucracy, the police, the Home Office, everybody to account is astonishing. And the effect of this, I think, is going to be accelerating political changes.
Today on Honestly, I speak to two women who spoke out years ago about what was happening when many people wanted to look the other way. They are Julie Bindel, the British feminist and author and activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Both took tremendous risks in highlighting this story. Bindel is a longtime feminist and the author most recently of Feminism for Women. She also writes a popular Substack. Hirsi Ali, a Free Press contributor, is also the author of many books, including Prey, Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights, which helped bring attention to the scandal in 2021. Today, Julie and Ayaan explained what happened, how these rapes and murders were covered up in the name of preserving social harmony, how it's arguably still happening, why Elon Musk is suddenly tweeting obsessively about it, and how Britain's ruling class is being forced to reckon with a scandal that it had, until recently, successfully ignored.
The Prime Minister has mentioned previous inquiries. He is right. There has been an inquiry into child sexual abuse, but it wasn't about the rape gang scandal. In its 468 pages, it mentioned Rotherham just once. Is the Prime Minister confident that we know the full extent of rape gang activity? In Rotherham alone, there have been over 1,400 victims across Oldham, Bradford, Bristol, Rochdale, and dozens more towns. There have been thousands more victims, but no one has joined the dots. No one has the total picture, and it is almost certainly still going on. Correct. One victim from Telford, and I know he says that victims have different views. We have different views across this house, but one victim from Telford says she wants a national inquiry because it will hold people accountable in a way that previous inquiries have not.
It's a story about how tolerance can run amok and how a civilized country can convince itself to accept the most uncivilized crimes imaginable. Stay with us. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Julie Bindel, welcome to Honestly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really, really glad that you guys are here for this important conversation. A few days ago in the Free Press, we ran a piece by a British writer called Dominic Green with the following headline: "The biggest peacetime crime and cover-up in British history." And he wasn't talking about a financial cover-up or government corruption. He was talking about mass rape. And I want to read the beginning of that story to both of you. "The grooming and serial rape of thousands of English girls by men of mostly Pakistani Muslim background over several decades is the biggest peacetime crime in the history of modern Europe. It went on for many years, it is still going on, and there has been no justice for the vast majority of the victims. British governments," he writes, "both Conservative and Labour, hoped they had buried this story after a few symbolic prosecutions in the 2010s, and it looked like they had succeeded until Elon Musk read some of the court papers and tweeted his disgust and bafflement on X over the new year. Britain now stands shame before the world. The public's suppressed wrath is bubbling to the surface in petitions, calls for a public inquiry, and demands for accountability. The scandal," he writes, "is already reshaping British politics. It's not just about the heinous nature of the crimes, it's that every level of the British system is implicated in its cover-up." Now, I suspect that most non-British listeners to this show are going to hear that and think, what? Like, in our post-Harvey Weinstein, post-Jeffrey Epstein age, where Americans now know that some of the richest and most powerful citizens were involved in horrific sex crimes, the notion still that there were gangs of men systemically raping young women and girls seems kind of too insane to be true, but it is true. And I want to start this conversation not with Elon Musk or the politics, although we'll get to that. I want to start with the basics here. When did this begin? Where did it happen? Who did it happen to? Who were carrying out these crimes? And Julie, I don't think there's anyone better suited to answer those questions than you. So I'd love it if you could jump in and start us off.
Well, it's a bit of a difficult question to answer about when did it start, because we've had child sexual abuse, organised, individual, in the home, in public places for as long as records go back and as long as feminists and others have been campaigning against it. But this particular phenomenon, we can locate right back to the 90s or even earlier, where we know that in northern cities and towns and villages, and of course elsewhere across the UK, but we first heard about them in the north, there were gangs of men, predominantly Pakistani Muslim men, in some of those particular towns, because that was the demographic of young out-of-work men more likely to be involved in criminality, who had previously been selling heroin. And when heroin became too hot for them to handle, because of course the war on drugs, girls became their merchandise. And how it worked was this. There would be all young girls are vulnerable, obviously, but particularly vulnerable girls were targeted. These girls may well have had a family history of abuse or neglect themselves. They may have been in care. There were also some middle-class girls, and not all of the girls were white, but they were predominantly so. And they would be targeted by boys pretty much of their age in shopping malls and parks and the like. And they got to know them and then said that they would introduce them to older, handsome men who had cars and they had alcohol and they had cigarettes and maybe marijuana. And these girls were having a great time. They were being given attention. They'd perhaps been bullied at school. Maybe school wasn't a factor in their lives. And soon they were passed up to older men, some of whom worked in takeaway outlets or other traditional jobs for migrants to those towns. And then, of course, the sexual abuse started full on. And the reason why I really try not to call them grooming gangs, although often it's just simpler because it's a known term, I mean, grooming is something that I do for about a minute and a half every morning in front of the mirror. It's meaningless. And these girls were targeted and these girls were raped and pimped. And what often gets missed out is that these girls were for profit. There were also sexual playthings for the men that were then going to be selling them from apartments and houses and even parks around the UK. They were trafficked around the UK, but they were merchandise. And then what happened was, in the late 1990s, in a city called Leeds in West Yorkshire, a mother called Irene Iverson, whose daughter Fiona, age 14, had been targeted by an older man. And this was a white, middle-class, very respectable family. And Irene Iverson decided that she wanted to set up an organisation, which she did, and she called it Coalition for the Removal of Pimping, CROP. Because she knew that her daughter was being sold. She knew that the daughters of many other women, many other parents were also being sold. And she couldn't get social services or the police to deal with the perpetrator. They weren't interested. They more or less said, well, if she's over 13 and it's a consensual relationship with this man, then why should we worry? And Irene was saying to them, but he's much older. She's smoking cannabis. She's staying at his house. They're obviously having sex. Nobody wanted to know. So through the organisation that she set up, that I then found out about very early on, the parents started putting together intelligence about the abusers. And this is where they discovered, when they talked together, and none of these parents, I mean, certainly none of the ones I met, were focusing on this as a problem because of the men's ethnicity. It was because the men were abusing their daughters. So they put together information such as number plates from cars, from vehicles that picked the girls up, names of these men, all other kind of information, the addresses. They sometimes followed their daughters to the takeaway outlets or the flats that they were being taken to, and then passed this information, which was quite an extensive bundle of information, to the police, to social services, and nothing was done. And there is a myth, and obviously we'll talk about this, but I'm sure we don't all agree. There is a myth that the police inaction was solely because of the men's ethnicity, that they didn't want a race riot because the far right and some racist agitators in the neighbourhoods would have gone berserk when they discovered that these men were predominantly Pakistani Muslim. But a big factor in this was what I'd seen right the way through the 80s and early 90s, which was the girls were seen as troublesome slags, which is a phrase that one of the police officers used about the girl, that the girls were worthless, that they were scum, that any girl that had sex with older men for cigarettes and vodka was bringing it on herself. But also there was a racist undertone to this, which is any white girl that has sex with a Pakistani is worse than scum. And so they really weren't interested because, as time immemorial, girls are disbelieved and they're blamed for their own abuse. And then, of course, we go further on through to the early 2000s when this became too big for the police to ignore. There were too many campaigners, too many child protection experts, too many sexual health clinic representatives saying we've got 14-year-old girls presenting with sexually transmitted infections, pregnancies, and asking for abortions. So then it got too big for them to ignore, and then some action occurred.
Okay, so my understanding, just sort of the big picture, is that this pattern of gangs of men of mostly Pakistani Muslim origin, their victims mostly working class white girls, was repeated in as many as 50 cities across the country. And a 2014 inquiry estimated that in Rotherham alone, 1,400 girls had been serially raped. Does that check out for both of you?
It does check out. And if you give perpetrators a message that if they rape a child, the child is the one more likely to be criminalised than him. And if you give society a message that you can buy a child for sex, paid rape, and nothing will ever happen to you because it's so normalised through pornography and through other cultural signifiers, then it's not surprising that this is happening, and happening increasingly where men are emboldened to do this. And of course, this isn't something that stands alone away from other child abuse, gangs, patterns, incidents. It is specific, and it was happening in these particular towns with these particular gangs, and it was monetized. But it really was nothing new. It was just becoming so obvious that the police wanted nothing to do with it. And once, of course, the threat of rioting, or race rioting as the police referred to it, popped up, it wasn't that the police cared that they would be called racist. We know pockets of the police are racist. We know that the police really aren't that hamstrung about it. But the last thing that they wanted to do was have to mop up after the riots.
I think this is maybe a place where the two of you might see it a little bit differently. Julie is seeing things from a very consistent feminist perspective. You know, this is the nature of men. This is the kind of crimes that men in groups commit, and we shouldn't be surprised by it. But Ayaan, I wonder if you disagree about that. To what extent does the fact that these are Pakistani immigrants, and I'm curious if they're sort of first or second generation, how should that inform the way that we understand the nature of the crimes and why there wasn't more of a sense of public outrage about them? Does their ethnicity and religion figure in here in a way that Julie maybe doesn't feel?
Yeah, I don't know if I would call it disagreement. I would say a different perspective, because obviously my background, I grew up a Muslim, I lived in Muslim countries, and I come at the problem differently. So in just right about that time, say my name to fame in 2003, 2004, or infamy, depending on who you speak to, is the publicizing of abuse against Muslim women by Muslim men, women who are subjected to honor killings, honor violence. They're locked up in their homes, they're forced into marriage, they're taken from the country and they're taken to the country of origin, and they're forced to marry people they don't want to. They're beaten up, they're murdered. Now, one anecdote I remember from a well-known Dutch publicist was, at one point he sat me down and he said, "You are trying to draw attention to abuse against Muslim women. Let me tell you about the middle classes in Europe. They're indifferent." And I remember asking him and saying, they're indifferent to the abuse of Muslim women, but will they be indifferent if European women are abused? And he said, no. If it is a blonde girl on national television and she's been sexually abused by one of these, there'll be huge outrage. The feminists will not stand for it. Unfortunately, fast forward to 2013, 14. At that time, I don't live in Europe anymore. I live in America. I'm an American citizen, and I've started the AHA Foundation. And all the anecdotes I'm getting from Europe are about these grooming gangs in Britain, a similar phenomenon in Holland, young men chasing women, raping them, men from Afghanistan especially, lots and lots of these brazen rapes that are occurring in Germany, in Austria. And so that for me is the reason to challenge the publicist's statement about, if it's about white European women, there will be universal outrage against this. And I started diving into the subject, and that's how Prey came about. And what I discover, unfortunately, is that exactly here I agree with Julie, that in what the British have come to call grooming gangs, that is the systematic sexual abuse of white working class girls and women by men, mostly Muslim, was dismissed as they're slags. I've heard the phrase white trash over and over again. And so there's a class element to this. But what I found, and in a chapter in Prey, I called it the playbook of denial, was the same reasoning that was applied to look away from the abuse of Muslim women was also applied to the abuse against now these white girls, not just by men in power, but by feminists, mostly by feminists. And what I found was what I would call layers of fear. It was almost like the mafia in the 1980s. Anybody who knows the story of the mafia, they know that different groups of people in society were afraid for different reasons. And during this period, I remember, there's nothing I could say, because sometimes I would talk to government officials in different countries and they would say, don't quote me. I would ask, can you give me the statistic in your country, now in Britain or in Sweden? I talked to German, France, and they would say, no, we don't collect statistics on the basis of religion. Then I would just ask a simple, straightforward question and say, what about sexual violence committed by foreign-born or the children of foreign-born men against women? I didn't even say against white women or black women, just women. Now, that stat was presented to me in different countries in different ways. One of them was, we have the stat, but we can't publish it. Another one said, I can give it to you, but you can't cite me, which makes my book useless. So at some point I resorted, if you look at the book, I resorted to just giving anecdotal accounts of these women and what was happening to them in every single country. I really want to emphasize this. It's not a disagreement. I think it's very important to get all of these perspectives on the table to get a full picture. I'm coming at this by saying it's very important to understand not just why the social workers were silent, why the police were silent, why politicians are silent. We're going to uncover all of that, and it's very, very important that we uncover that. But let's also do the other side. Why is it that these men are committing these crimes in this way? What is wrong with the families and the wider community of these men? Why do they tolerate it against their own women and then against women that they don't think of as their women? And we have to answer that question. And once you go down that path, then you open the door to the issues of immigration, the failure of integration, the role of Islam in this. And the one key question that Europeans simply don't want to talk about, which is that what do we do about it? Because this is going to involve the mass deportation of large numbers of people who are here, some of them who are also born here. And so people are in some way, if you go through the inventory of fears, I think the biggest fear is, what do we do then?
Well, Ayaan, as I mentioned before, your book Prey was one of the first places, other than Douglas Murray's book, Strange Death of Europe, where I came across some of these anecdotes. And I just want to share them with listeners because, frankly, reading about these over the past few days, again, they were keeping me up. It takes a lot to keep me up at night. I read about a lot of bad things in a day. So let's just share maybe two of these stories so people have a sense of what we're talking about. In the piece that we ran, the writer writes about one 12-year-old girl who's named Sophie, and she's molested in a graveyard by a man who's named Ali. And these are not their real names, I'm assuming. A desk officer told her to come back to the police precinct with an adult when she was sober, and two men accosted her in the police station. Joined by a third, they raped her in their car. When they dumped her on the street, she asked a man named Sarwar Ali for directions. He then took her to his home, raped her, and gave her money for a bus fare home. A man named Shakil Chowdhury pulled up in his car then and offered to take her home. He abducted her and took her to a house where he and 4 other men then repeatedly raped her. That's one story. Here's another one. This is a girl who's called Lucy in Telford. Azhar Ali Mahmood groomed Lucy Lowe from the age of 12 and impregnated her at 14. He burned her alive in her own home with her mother, her disabled sister, and her unborn second child, who was also fathered by Mahmood, this rapist. If you went to the average British person, would they know about stories like this, Julie?
I think a lot of people choose not to know about stories like this. And whilst we have just this complacency around the most vicious, misogynistic, sadistic online pornography easily available for 10, 11-year-olds, even younger. And we pretend that this isn't educating our children into becoming violent, misogynistic psychopaths, then I think we're losing the plot. Many British people don't want to know the truth about child sexual abuse. When we have scandals such as these rape gangs, when we have the BBC with Jimmy Savile, a prolific abuser who was abusing boys, girls, men, women, and corpses in a hospital where he worked, where we have the most horrific stories such as the one about Lucy, the other girls, the stories that I've heard in court, listening to some of the testimony of the victims also keeps me awake at night. And I think that the problem with the British public not digesting this is because we constantly monsterize these men as though they are somehow satanic figures, rather than the men that live and work amongst us, that are in families that are seen as respectable. And that's why I'm very cautious in the way that I depict these men. Now, what they do is monstrous. What they do is evil. But these men are able to hide. They don't hide in plain sight. They operate in plain sight. Now, I actually agree with everything.
I want to interrupt now. Sorry.
Go ahead, Ayaan.
I think that it's true that a large number of the British public didn't want to know and turned away. But here's where I want to bring in the story of Tommy Robinson.
Let me set us up, just for the listener who doesn't know who he is. Tommy Robinson is in prison right now. He is serving an 18-month sentence for defaming a Syrian immigrant. Robinson, for years, has been denounced by mainstream conservatives, even conservatives like the right-wing populist leader Nigel Farage, who leads the Reform Party. But now there's sort of this relook at Robinson, saying that he should be released from prison. I think I've got that about right.
He did before anyone else, because it was happening in his neighborhoods. He's born in Luton, he's working class, and his cousin was raped by a grooming gang. And he brought this to the attention of the British people over and over again. That man is in prison. And forgive me if I say, if you look at this particular topic, he has done more than any feminist in history to bring this to light. He is in prison. There are British people who want to know it, and other Europeans, but once they know it and once they have the courage to publicize it, what happens to them is this punishment by the media that vilify them, by the police that arrest them, by the courts that charge them with contempt of court. I think it is this suicidal. I don't know what to describe it as. If Tommy Robinson were an American citizen, we would have a statue of him. He would be a hero. He would be getting the Medal of Freedom. The guy is in prison. And I think that is one of the things is, why is that, Julie? Why is it that the British members of the public who want to know it, who publicize it, who risk their lives doing it, they are the ones who are thrown in prison? There are examples that, Barry, in the piece by Dominic Green that you published of the girl who goes, they put a nail through her tongue. The grueling story that you just described of death. Some of these things, some of these victims are the ones who get arrested by the police. They are the ones who get punished. And that is something I think that we cannot easily bypass by saying, oh, there are some, these men are not monstrous. Not all Muslim men are monstrous, but the men who are doing this are monstrous. And they invoke a culture and a religion that is monstrous. And it is high time that we say things as they are.
I agree entirely, Ayaan, but you are wrong about Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson just tells endless lies. I don't trust him. Not at all. He's no hero. And he certainly doesn't give a damn about these girls, in my view. But really, the lies that man has told are extraordinary. So we disagree on this, Ayaan, respectfully, of course.
Of course.
When you say feminists, I think you mean the liberal sort that do the whole sex work is work, trans women are women, stripping is good for exercise.
That's exactly who I mean. And they're also the ones who shut us up. They're the ones who shut you up. They're the ones who shut me up.
Absolutely right. They are the cultural relativists who will bend over backwards to defend the most appalling practices of Islam. They defend Sharia courts. They defend the full face veil. They are a disgrace and they have no right to call themselves feminists. It's appalling. And I will not be lumped in with those women. And I know that you're not doing that.
I'm
because
not doing that.
The feminists, of course, but the feminists that I have been in cahoots with for more than 4 decades campaign to end male violence towards women and girls. We are not cultural relativists. We work across every single issue that affects women, particularly those with cultures that perpetrate the worst violence against women and girls. And I would name that as Islam. And it's the religion that gets a free pass in my country and elsewhere, because it's seen as somehow untouchable, that we're not supposed to challenge it.
The thing I want to stick on just for a second is the nature of why people are scared. Looking at this from the outside, I think there's good reason to be scared. In other words, when you're living in a country in which a member of parliament, and I'm thinking now of Mike Freer, I believe his name is, basically resigns from parliament because of so many threats to his life, because he has had the gall to do things like stand up for his Jewish constituency or stand up for Israel, had to walk around wearing a stab vest, ultimately had his office, I think, was the victim of an arson attack, and ultimately thought, screw this isn't worth it. This is not worth my life, which is frankly a pretty rational conclusion. Or just, when you think about why is the average British person not caring? Well, maybe it's because looking at the nature of the problem is pretty terrifying. If you look at the nature of the problem here, you could arguably say, holy shit, excuse my language, a lot of people have been let into this country that do not share basic fundamental British or Western values of toleration and pluralism and liberalism broadly defined. There doesn't seem to be a plan on the part of either party to solve that. And so we're just going to kind of wish it away. From my perspective, that seems to be a huge dynamic at play here of why people don't want to look. It's because when you look, the nature of the thing feels so big. And perhaps
Barry, it is true. It is fear. And there are different layers of fear. And I'm glad that you brought in the MP. There is the naked threat of, if you do anything about this issue, we will come and rape you, burn you, kill you. And these people, they make it, they do act on these threats. I've been living with protection for a very long time. I know exactly what I'm talking about. And so the threat from, whether it is Islamist driven or tribal driven or whatever it is, but from the immigrant Muslim men and their families, that is absolutely key. There's another layer of fear, which is more sinister, which is that some of the politicians have come to depend on the vote of those immigrants. And so the working classes, the white working classes, numerically are no longer important to them. They don't serve them. They don't serve the Jewish minorities. I've been told over and over again, Jewish minorities in Europe are numerically insignificant. So if you want to keep their vote, and this is the Labour Party in Britain, and not just the Labour Party, even for the Tory party, if they wanted voters from those constituencies, then they had to they had to look away from these problems. And this applies to different countries. There is that fear as well. And then there are different layers of fears, not just the threat of physical abuse and murder and all of this, but some people, and this is why an inquiry is absolutely necessary, some people have taken money, or they've taken sexual favors, or they're in some other way compromised. And so you have different people who are afraid for different reasons. And then, of course, there is this giant, and you're very familiar with this more than I am, Barry, the progressive media on the other side of the Atlantic in Europe is committed to this model of diversity, of bringing in more immigration, that's just an ideological thing. And so the media itself, the BBC in the UK, Sky News, Channel 4, the national newspapers, many of them are also, there's this conspiracy, ideological conspiracy, to look away from these problems. And they have their own reasons and their own fears. And I think all of that, that whole box has to be opened.
And we also have...
Sorry, go on.
I'm sorry, Ayaan. We also have to look at moral cowardice and personal cowardice. So when I first published my investigation into the grooming gangs in 2007 in the Sunday Times, The Guardian wouldn't run it. I'd asked them repeatedly, and the editor said that we would be seen as racist, despite the fact that she knew I'm a feminist on the left and had been concerned about child sexual abuse committed by perpetrators of all stripes. But even so, there was this cowardice. And when I took it to the Sunday Times, the first thing that happened that same day was I was put on the website, my name was added to Islamophobia Watch, a website that had been set up by two men, white men on the hard left, who decided any criticism of Islam or Islamists was Islamophobic. Well, I reject the word Islamophobic, so I didn't care that I was on that watch list. In fact, I was quite proud of it because I thought, good, I've made a mark. There were lots of women, ex-Muslim women, women from different countries living or who'd escaped living under Islamic rule, who were saying, thank you for publishing this. All of the white feminists that I knew at the time in the media, not my friends, not my colleagues that were fighting male violence, were also scared to publish it. In fact, some of them came up to me at media events and were saying, that was, they didn't say brave, they said that was risky. I was absolutely sickened and appalled. And that cowardice remains today. And I on one level, I can understand where it comes from because they've chosen to dismiss the lives of huge numbers of women that do live with these violent, abusive men that get away with it because they're seen to be somehow special. But it's unforgivable, and I will never forgive it.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of the cover-up here and the systematic nature of the cover-up, because when you look at all of the layers of it, it almost looks like a conspiracy. Here's what Green writes in that piece. Social workers were intimidated into silence. Local police ignored, excused, and even abetted pedophile rapists across dozens of cities. Senior police and home office officials deliberately avoided action in the name of maintaining what they called community relations, a topic I want to discuss further. Local councillors and members of parliament rejected pleas for help from the parents of raped children. Charities, NGOs, and Labour MPs accused those who discussed the scandal of racism and, there's that word, Julie, Islamophobia. The media mostly ignored or downplayed the biggest story of their lifetimes. Zealous in their incuriosity, most of Britain's media elite remained barnacled to the bubble of Westminster politics and its self-serving priorities. And here's Green's understanding of why. They did this, he writes, to defend a failed model of multiculturalism and to avoid asking hard questions about failures of immigration policy and assimilation. They did this because they were afraid of being called racist or Islamophobic. They did this because Britain's traditional class snobbery has fused with the new snobbery of political correctness. Julie, is he right there? What would you add? What would you disagree with?
Yes, I'd add misogyny. He's missed that out. I thought it was an excellent report, but he did miss that out. As I was saying earlier, these girls are seen as worthless because they're girls. And then when you add the other demographics, of course, they become even lower scum to those in power and control. When I was trying to interview people to write the first piece, it took me 2 years on and off to do the investigation and to get to speak to people on the record who would admit to any of this. And more often than not, they would say to me, well, obviously, if I'm on the record about the fact that we know that this was cultural and it was a cover-up, then it will be very difficult to work within this community. And I said, how can you work in this community? They're talking about with a heavy Pakistani Muslim presence. When this is going on behind closed doors and on the streets, if you were to speak out, then this would clearly mean that questions would be asked. But as you said, we had politicians, we had George Galloway, that disgraceful human being who was a member of Parliament for Bradford West, a white man who sucked up to Islamists so much that, quite frankly, I think he definitely believed he'd become one, who told the most outrageous lies about a woman who thankfully kicked him out of his seat, Naz Shah, who herself was from a Muslim background, who wanted to expose the corruption that had been allowed to flourish when he was member of Parliament. Because, of course, the Muslim men, the so-called community leaders, and it's interesting that white people have no such community leaders, but the so-called community leaders, all older patriarchal Muslim men, would block vote, and the women would be told that they had to stay indoors and couldn't vote. So the whole thing was run like a cabal. And in the meantime, the cowardice of social services and sexual health clinics, there was no reason for them to stay quiet. Many of the police were on the take. Yeah, it's true about the sexual favours, but most of them just couldn't be bothered, like they usually can't, about sexual abuse of women and girls. But social workers, when they went to the homes and saw what was happening to these girls, the child, Charlene Downs, who went missing, that I wrote about, she went missing in 2003. Social workers walked into a bedroom at her home and found an adult man in bed with his trousers down on top of her and didn't report it. Just thought, this is what these people do. They're scum.
One of the more disturbing things that I've read in the past few days is this quote by a former Labour MP for, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Rochdale? Am I getting that right?
Oh, Rochdale.
Rochdale, excuse me. Simon Danchuk, okay? One of these cities that were victimized by these gangs. He says that he was warned by top leaders in his party not to highlight who the perpetrators were. This is a direct quote. What surprised me more than anything is that I had senior politicians tell me not to mention the ethnicity or religious bias of these perpetrators. They said it would affect the Labour vote. It was quite clear. They were quite clear about that. How did this silence, how did the identity of the perpetrators here create a kind of omerta or code of silence around politicians' ability to talk about it, especially on the left, Ayaan?
So if you go back in a little bit in time, in the early 2000s, late 1990s, there were very hot debates and discussions on what sort of societies we are now in Europe. I lived in the Netherlands at the time, but the discussion was going on all over Europe. And what we had was this classical model where the system of law looks at individuals and all individuals were equal before the law. So if you're a perpetrator of any crime, you would be treated absolutely like everyone else. But then we had this Muslim minority that we were trying to assimilate or coexist with or accommodate, whatever it was. And there was a whole school of thought, I think a lot of them came from America, who were pushing this multiculturalist model. So when you say community relations, that is one of the centerpieces of multiculturalism, which is, instead of being this Western society, which was racist, Eurocentric, oppressor, oppressed, there's a whole criticism of that. The multicultural model says minorities are going to be given exceptions and exemptions, and that is one way of we don't like using the word assimilate, but it was integrating them into society. And so this model is now bankrupt. This model has given us these grooming gangs. This model has given us all sorts of crimes. This model has failed. Now, at certain times, for instance, Angela Merkel in 2015, 2016, after that rape gang, there was this mass rape where immigrant men had started groping and harassing German women. She came out and said multiculturalism had failed. A little before or after that, David Cameron, who was then Prime Minister in Britain, also came out and said multiculturalism had failed. And even though these leaders took this position, multiculturalism isn't going to work, they did nothing about the policies in place. So the community relations, the community policing, giving responsibilities to members within those ethnic communities who are not qualified to do it. In America, you would call this diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of these things happened. And so the police who are covering, we're not even allowed to tell you who their ethnicity is. We're not allowed to tell you who the lawyers are who are covering up for this. So I would ask the question, within the old system, let's open the whole can of worms open, and then you're going to discover who exactly was where, when, and did what. And a lot of this covering up is, part of it is ideological because we are committed to the model of multiculturalism. That is what we invested in. That's where we poured a lot of taxpayer money into. And when you pull away from that, what are you going to get? And then parts of it is the corruption. It's a model. Community relations is a model that has corrupted the system of social work, of police work, of the relationship between politicians and these communities. You can just now go to a so-called community leader and get a heap of votes instead of going there and making your case. So the system is corrupted in so many different ways, and that has to be opened up. And that is going to lead to the abandoning not just of multiculturalism in name, but the multiculturalist policies. And again, that is going to take us to, if we have, hypothetically speaking, about 1 million people in Britain who are incriminated in this grooming gangs scandal alone, what are we going to do with those men? Okay, you then have started to talk about deportations and things like that. And that is the one thing I have discovered in every single European country. That is the one thing that you can't talk about. Besides, please, Barry, let me say, up until this year, and Kier Starmer, who is the current Prime Minister, has only been Prime Minister for 6 months, spoke about it first. He kind of opened up, became honest about the sheer number of people from those countries that came in 2020, 21, 22, 20, in the last 5 years. And he put the blame on the Tories. So the immigration, the borders are still wide open, the numbers are still coming in, and the problems are building up.
There were people that did try and blow the whistle. I know there's one female detective, Maggie Oliver. Why don't you tell me about her, Julie?
Maggie Oliver is a hero. I definitely would have a statue of Maggie Oliver. I know her very well. She is relentless. She set up a charity since walking out of the police in disgust that supports the victims and raises awareness. Now, Maggie gave 13 years of her life to the police, to Greater Manchester Police. She was tasked with getting the stories, the statements from some of the victims who trusted her eventually, because you would if you work with Maggie. She's that sort of person. And then, of course, her senior officers let those girls down catastrophically, stratospherically. And I've met these girls, now women. I've interviewed some of these young women. They are utterly amazing, but their lives have been pretty much destroyed by the betrayal. And one girl in particular who Maggie was trying to help by getting her statement and getting her abusers in court, she was put on the indictment as a perpetrator when some of the abusers were on trial. So rather than them being on trial for what they'd done to her, she was called and indicted as a pimp, as a madam. She was a child at the time. And these girls were tasked with bringing back other victims for these men. And these men were extremely dangerous. And as we know, they've murdered girls. So You did what you were told. So imagine being let down by that. And Maggie exposed that. She spoke about it, she wrote about it, and she now acts to change things. There was also Jane Senior, who was working in child protection, within child protection broadly, who also spoke out, and she was vilified. But there were very few that did at the time. There really were so few people. And mostly these girls, when they would go, as I said, to sexual health clinics with the most appalling injuries and diseases, and of course pregnancies as children, were not even supported or reported. What sort of a society do we live in where that is not actioned? It's beggars belief. But for the whistleblowers, what they did, and, you know, I do include a couple of journalists in this who obviously were in a very different situation to those that were going to lose their jobs, as Maggie did. You know, they were the ones that did what the police and what social services and what the Crown Prosecution Service was supposed to be doing and didn't.
For those people who have followed this scandal, most people, I think, considered it largely to be something in the rearview mirror, right? At least until last week, right? And the person that has sort of brought it front and center as a international conversation in the English-speaking world, not just in the UK, is because of Elon Musk, who started tweeting, as he does, obsessively about it. And he hasn't stopped. And some people could argue that his tweeting has arguably done more for this issue, given his power and the power of X than anything else. And I guess just to start, I wanted to ask, you know, as people who have been doggedly reporting and following this issue for so long, as people who have been screaming about this story and trying to get people to pay attention, does that anger you that it's taken Elon Musk weighing in? Yeah, Ayaan, go ahead.
No, I'm infinitely grateful to Elon Musk. All of us right now, I mean, every single person, as Julie just described, every single person who tried to bring these issues to the attention of the people who can actually do something about it, they've been silenced, they've been locked up, they've been ignored, they've been vilified, they've been bankrupted. They can't do any of that to Elon Musk. And so for me, I'm so grateful to Elon Musk. He's using his superpowers to say, I am going to give a voice to the voiceless. And he's just one in multi-generation human being. He's my hero. He's amazing. And I hope that he continues. I hope he follows through to the bottom. I hope he gets to the bottom of this and that he stays through for the whole thing.
Julie, from a feminist perspective, does it annoy you that a lot of women have been saying a lot about this topic for more than 2 decades, and only now it seems like the world is paying attention?
I find Elon Musk a repellent human being. The point is that this now has happened, and it is on the international stage. And so my concern as a feminist isn't to hark back and think, why won't we listen to? We're rarely listened to. We have to really push and scream and shout, and eventually we are. But the man that, you know, one of the wealthiest men on the planet who owns the biggest media platform, of course, is going to have a little bit more traction than we do. So it's not about that. It's about, what do we do now? What do we do next? How can we keep this on the agenda of child sexual abuse and the perpetrators of child sexual abuse and the failure of the criminal justice system? Because, of course, there are other issues that are involved. But if it just becomes about immigration, if it just becomes about what I would call a knee-jerk racist response to why this happens, we'll take our eye off the endemic problem of child sexual abuse that, quite frankly, was there before the Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs and would certainly be there afterwards.
Okay, now I'm full of disagreements on all of this. I do not think that Elon Musk is a repellent man. I think he is a genius, and I think he's one of the best human beings alive. I think, Julie, I disagree with, yes, in Britain and in the rest of the world, in the Western world, there were sexual crimes against children and against women. But what you're looking at now is very different. And immigration is front and center of this problem. And I think we can't resolve this without looking at it. And frankly, I think we do have to retire the word racist or racism, because it's used in the most dishonest way to shut up discussions like this and to silence people. So if we really care about these girls and we want these problems to be resolved, bye-bye to words like racism and phrases like far right. And Elon Musk deserves every woman's gratitude for what he's doing now.
Julie, do you want to respond?
I mean, I would like to respond in terms of the issue about racism. I absolutely agree that term is misused, overused, used against the wrong people, used to silence constantly. I think what we need to do when we're looking at the endemic problem of childhood sexual abuse is not close the door about the lessons that should have been learned for the decades that many of us have been campaigning to end it before the grooming gang phenomenon. And of course, there are specific issues relating to that phenomenon, but as well, it's same old. Complacency within every single criminal justice system, that you can, I mean, the incompetence is off the scale. The lack of concern and care about the victims is off the scale, and the normalization of these crimes that are perpetrated by men is also quite astounding. So I think two things can be true.
One thing that Elon has been tweeting about a lot is that the UK, he says, has a two-tiered justice system that essentially favors minorities. And just to choose one of many examples, the UK is a place where people have been arrested in recent months for racist tweets. And yet, many of the abusers in the kinds of stories that we talked about earlier in this conversation are walking free, having served little or no jail time. Is he right? Is the UK a place where justice is still blind, or is there a two-tiered justice system?
They adopted the multicultural model. So they have a two-tier cultural system. That's a matter of policy. That's a logical outcome of the multiculturalist model. You have minorities are treated differently from majorities. It's the logic of the system. So yes, he's absolutely right. And it's not just in Britain. It's everywhere where the multicultural model applies. It's in Germany, it's in France, it's in Sweden. The only countries that resisted are countries like Denmark and Switzerland.
In many ways, the justice system has completely failed, for example, women. When we look at women being arrested or warned or given cautions for non-crime hate incidents, when you may misgender somebody on social media, it's utterly outrageous. When the victims of domestic violence, for example, can't get a police call out, can't get a police officer to come to the house, where social media is being monitored, but not actual crime, face-to-face crime in the streets and in the home. So there's always a consciousness amongst those of us that try to fight and improve the system that it can be two-tier and inconsistent.
One of the people that's sort of also being revisited in light of the revisiting of this story more generally is Kier Starmer, the current prime minister who was the head of the Agency for Criminal Prosecutions between 2008 and 2013 when many of these crimes were committed. How culpable is Kier Starmer here? Is he a villain of the story?
You know, Barry, it's quite an interesting one because I think he's a terrible politician. I think he's a coward. I think he's a posturer. I don't think he'll last very long. I would say he was a disappointment, but I'm not surprised at all. I thought he would be terrible. But when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, although he could have done more, and of course one can always do more, he did more to prosecute crimes against children and women than any other DPP. And in fact, I directly worked with Kier Starmer on a report that I wrote on female genital mutilation, FGM, which was being carried out and is still being carried out in private clinics in Harley Street, and where a blind eye was being turned to families taking their daughters out of the country for FGM. And he was the one that introduced a criminal offence, and he helped me with my report and spoke at the launch of that report. So yes, the man is just so inadequate in so many ways. But I have to say that there are way worse than him when it comes to this issue. But he's been, in my view, quite disgraceful the way he's responded to this re-emergence of the grooming gang scandal by saying that his concern was about an MP being targeted rather than the girls being targeted, being abused, being raped, having been raped. And I was also concerned about the MP being targeted. I think it was wholly wrong. But for him to prioritise that when he answered the question about it, what a wrong move.
Elon is really seizing on the Kier Starmer of it all. He's saying things like prison for Starmer, Starmer's complicit in the crimes. All of this has bubbled up. There was a Bloomberg report out really recently that said that several senior officials in the UK have urged Trump to distance himself from Musk over this whole thing, basically saying that his statements about the prime minister and the UK in general, he's saying that civil war in the UK is inevitable, are inflammatory and not how an ally speaks about another ally. I'm curious how this is being received by people in the UK.
I don't know about Kier Starmer when he was a prosecutor and his relationship with these cases. If I were Kier Starmer, I would want an inquiry if I knew that I was on the right side of things. And one reason that I suspect he's resisting the inquiry, I think for me, is political. There might be other reasons, but that is for the British people to look into. He's only been in politics. He's only been in office. Sorry, he's been in politics for a long time. He's only been in office for 6 months. Normally, I've been a politician myself. When a major story like this, bursts into the light, if you've been in office only for 6 months, you would embrace an inquiry because you would say, these people have been in office for the last 15 years. You put all the shame and blame, you put it on the Tories. That's a great opportunity that you have. And so it's baffling to me, based on my knowledge of how politics works, why on earth is he resisting an inquiry? This should be and the person who's calling for the inquiry is from the party who was in office for the last decade and a half. So that doesn't make sense. And so why is he resisting an inquiry? And so I have to speculate and analyze and think he is resisting an inquiry because his party depends on the Muslim votes. It's a large number of the people in Birmingham, in Leeds, all of these constituents who put him in office. These are the Muslims that put him in office, and these are the people, it's the communities that harbor the grooming gangs. And so in that sense, he's compromised. It's the same with, I would say, the mayor of London. I don't think the mayor of London is an Islamist, but I think he depends on the vote of the Islamists. And so when these issues come up, why are you suppressing an inquiry into the grooming gangs, or why are you tolerating the blatant anti-Semitism on the streets? I think with these politicians, the first thing that comes to their minds is the votes. Let's protect the votes.
But then are the Conservatives also compromised? Because as you just pointed out, for the past 15 years, the UK has been run by the Tories, right? It's not like Jeremy Corbyn was running the party during this scandal. It was David Cameron and Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, people who were elected.
They are compromised, but they've been driven out of office. Yes, of course.
But my point is, from an American perspective, it would seem like, forgetting the morality, right, and what's right and what's wrong, it would seem strategic for the Conservative Party, who is generally more, conservative about things like immigration, generally less fearful about criticizing Islam, to talk about this a lot. And yet they also did nothing, or seemed to do almost nothing. Explain that dynamic, because from an American perspective, that just seems really strange.
So again, from purely political calculation parts, in 2019, Boris Johnson won what was called the Red Wall. People who live in these the white working classes, it is their communities that have been basically displaced and challenged by the negative consequences of immigration. The Boris Johnson went out of office not because of policies, but because of I'm trying to talk to an American audience and say they were talking about cake. This was, I mean, I don't know, but it was this most juvenile of all cabinets I've ever seen. They were backstabbing one another. There was a lot of incompetence and ineptitude that was going on there. But I think in these last 5 years, from 2019 to now, the Tories did not stand up to the promises or to the things that they promised. The working classes, they said that they were going to reduce the number of immigrants. Immigration went up. They didn't do anything about assimilation. They didn't do anything about crime. It's on their watch that crime went up. So all I can say is that they've been punished at the ballot box. Now they have a new leader, and the new leader, Kemi Badenoch, has come out and said, I admit that we've made all of these mistakes and we're going to do things differently. So she's talking about a future. And if I were her now, I mean, this is why I'm baffled by, again, from a political calculation perspective, I am baffled by Kier Starmer's behavior, because he's basically giving the Tories a free pass. And it is this guy is inept, you know, the Labour Party, they don't know how to govern, and people will want something else soon. And again, for me, it depends on how the new Tory leader, Kemi Badenoch, how she handles these things, and to what extent does Badenoch have what it takes? Because clearly, Kier Starmer doesn't.
Do you think that she does? And Julie, do you?
I think that we have to get the abusers convicted before anything can be done, and then we can disagree on what solution there might be. But these men are not convicted. We have a rape conviction rate in the UK, well, across England and Wales, of under 1% from reporting through to the end. So the system is in absolute disarray. I agree with Ayaan. I think that Kier Starmer isn't fit for purpose in office, and I think that the Tories destroyed many of the communities, the National Health Service, the school system, you know, just many of the infrastructures were on its knees, and Labour has inherited that. But I think they're not fit for purpose. And the first thing that I would have done with Kier Starmer, because he had to respond to Elon Musk, was to say that his first and foremost concern was the victims of those gangs, past, present, and unfortunately future, because there will be future victims.
The Italian mob in the U.S. was an embarrassment to Italian Americans. And it was basically Italian Americans that wound up destroying it, or at least turning it into a shadow of what it once was. You know, when he was U.S. attorney in New York, Rudy Giuliani, now he's, you know, fallen into disarray. But at the time, he did a lot, and he launched his political career by sort of dismembering the mafia. Are there any prominent Muslim leaders or politicians in the UK that are trying to do something similar when it comes to these rape gangs, who maybe we haven't heard of that we should be paying attention to?
I have heard of a man called Ben Habib. I've heard other names, and I totally agree with you that for this mafia to be defeated, this Islamist grooming gangs mafia to be defeated, a lot of it has to come from the inside. And that is why if it doesn't come from the inside, then the future relationship between these communities and British communities is just one of, it's one of war then, because if you're doing this to our girls and women, how are we supposed to react, right? So it has to come from, so there are names. I also want to point out that we've been talking about this issue as a matter of sex crimes, as if these men are doing it just for sexual gratification. There's a component we haven't discussed, which is almost, it's a war. I've been asked, does Islam say that women should be raped? Can these men find any justification within Islam for what they do? And what I find, if you look at scripture, Islamic scripture, is the only time it's allowed to take women during wartime, infidel women. They become, when you are victorious over the enemy, the women you take in, they become slaves and they become the women that your right hand owns, and you can rape them as you please in any number you want. And one of the things that's going on in the mosques, these are mosques that are run by the Muslim Brotherhood, is this constant preaching that we are at the enemy, we are at war with the enemy, this enemy are the infidels, etc. So when these men hear that, they apply that enemy concept, and that is how they justify their actions. So you do need then leaders from within who want to challenge the preachings of the Muslim Brotherhood, who want to challenge the preachings of the infrastructure that they have set up. And there, I see a light at the end of the tunnel, because the core Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, they have driven the Muslim Brotherhood out of their countries. And those that are driven out, they come to Europe and America, and we harbor them. So right now, for this dynamic to change, I think in 2025, there's a huge opportunity for Muslims who hate this, and Westerners, Brits and others, to join forces and say, let's get rid of this monstrosity.
Both of you in your own lives have taken tremendous personal risk to stand up for your views, whether in criticizing Islamism or standing up for feminism. Julie, you've been run out of public libraries in recent years in the UK because of your views about feminism. Ayaan has lived under armed guard for many years. And I guess given the sort of conspiracy of, if not silence, then the conspiracy of whispers around this topic, I wonder if we could end on a personal note, why each of you has been willing to take such personal risk to stand up on this issue, going back many years, long before Elon Musk owned Twitter.
It's the right thing to do, and it's a better way to live your life. But not only that, if I think about the women and some men who are taking risks and standing up and speaking out and defying the worst atrocities in other countries, in other contexts, then it just makes me feel morally obligated. But also, to be honest, I get a huge amount of gratification from being amongst people, and I'm a small grain in the sand on the beach of the world, who are wanting to leave the world behind a slightly better place than the one that they were born into. So I'm not going to let them bully me. I'm not going to let them stop me from doing what I'm doing. And the tradition of proper feminism, not the liberal sort, not the fun sort, is to never, ever be cowed and bullied by the oppressor.
Ayaan?
So I agree with Julie on all of that. And what I have found is when I try to shut out these problems and think, let other people do it, I can't sleep at night. I keep thinking, if I think it is other people's problems, then when I am in trouble, other people will think, well, someone else will help her. And so if you know of a problem, you should do something about it. If, like this discussion now, I'm really grateful that it's out in the open, and it's really, I'm not doing much. I'm just filling in the gaps, little gaps of where things are open. And quite recently, I've come to believe in God. And sometimes it's just, it's great to know that when we talk about service and duty and charity, it's a gift from God that I'm able to do this.
Well, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Julie Bindel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you.